Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are very excited to be here tonight with Barrett Holmes Pitner and Andrew Thompson. Barrett Holmes Pitner is a columnist, journalist, and philosopher whose work has been published in the Daily Beast, the BBC, The Guardian, and elsewhere. He is the founder of the Sustainable Culture Lab, a cultural think tank with the goals of influencing policy by working with legislators and decision makers and impacting culture at a grassroots level through events, work, and cultural offerings. He lives in Washington, D.C., and The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide, and the Erasure of Culture in America is his first book. We are here with Andrew Thompson, who is the assistant professor of political science of Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at the George Washington University. Dr. Thompson's research examines how threat and anxiety shift attitudes about American democracy. Specifically, he explores how racial demographic changes motivate stronger support for anti-democratic practices among the American public. He shows that partisan considerations are central to understanding how Americans process information about the changing U.S. demographic landscape and how supportive they are of anti-democratic policies. Ultimately, Dr. Thompson shows us that as the country diversifies, democratic considerations and overall support for American democracy are bound to shift dramatically among the mass public. So we are joined tonight as well by the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history. Morris Gardner is in the chat, dropping additional knowledge and links to the archive. So we want to let folks know those links are going to stay up in perpetuity. So they are additional resources to enhance your understanding of the conversation that's going on in front of you tonight. But we want you to sort of keep your attention on the conversation. Just trust that you can go back and click through those. And even after the event has ended, those will just stay up. You can revisit this URL as many times as you want for free. You can share it. And those resources will be here. So thank you to Morris and thank you to the Auburn Avenue Research Library for always deepening the conversation. Finally, I want to encourage folks who are watching at home, feel free to shout out where you're watching from in the chat and also ask questions if you like. I know it's going to be a really robust conversation. Barrett definitely was like, this is a dense book. We're ready to get into it, which I know we are. And I'm really excited. It's a really interesting book and a really a great, already answering a lot of questions for a lot of folks. But if you have specific questions that you want to bring to the table, just put them in the Ask a Question tab. And if there's time, Andrew will try to bring them into the conversation. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to get out of the way because I'm very eager to hear this. But I'm very grateful that you're here tonight to celebrate this book with us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for organizing this, for bringing us together. And I'm really just excited to get into a discussion. So Barrett, do you want to begin? Let's go.
Yeah, let's start. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, let's I think the place that I want to begin from is one just to kind of get us all on the same page. And of course, like there's a concept that you're advancing and is incredibly important. It is the main point of the book, and I just want us to be on the same page with regard to like a definition of ethnocide and kind of the way in which you are thinking about it. The one other thing I just want to mention before we get into this is I thoroughly enjoyed the entire read of this book. I found it to be like a tour de force of the discussion of this concept, but also, it's hearkening back to so this is just on a personal note. I'm trained within political science, but I'm also trained within philosophy at Marquette University. And the way in which you wove in phenomenology and existentialist thought, especially within this, was just like you had, like I was just, like I mentioned, thoroughly enthralled throughout the entirety of it. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I'm really glad that you've enjoyed my book. That's the goal. So ethnocide, the concept of the book is raising awareness of this term and showing people the impact of this term in American society and the world. So ethnocide is the destruction of a people's culture while keeping the people. And this word was first coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide. He was a Polish Jew who escaped Europe during the Holocaust. And when he came to the US, his goal was to raise awareness of the atrocity being inflicted to his people. But the absence of a word to describe this systematic destruction meant it was really hard for Americans in the world at large to really wrap their brain around and understand what was happening. So he decided he needed to make a word. And so he made the word genocide, which, has gone on to change the world. And genos comes from people, incide means murder. And he also created the word ethnocide, which he thought would be interchangeable because Jewish people are also a culture or a nation, which is an ethnos. But ethnocide, that word was kind of forgotten for about 60 years. And my book brings it back to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. I'll tell you, my personal journey to find the word was actually that I tried to create my own word, a similar journey for Lemkin, to describe how I perceived the horrors and inequality and systemic problems regarding race and whatnot in the United States. So I formulated the word, and then I found I had to go research, make sure that someone else hadn't already made it, and then I found that somebody else had, but our work went perfectly together. And so with ethnocide, I described the transatlantic slave trade because the goal of that was to keep the bodies of African people, but systematically destroy every facet of African culture so that Europeans could create a chattel slavery system in the New World and then build their societies upon this systemic, perpetual division and exploitation. And we live in a world where the foundational idea that has been the root of the division, the root of even our racial classifications, we don't have an awareness of it. So how can we adequately combat the problem of our society if we can't name what that problem is, if we can't name that crime? And so the book names the crime, articulates the many manifestations of it, and proposes ways that we can combat it.
So I really want to start with the kind of sort of origin points that you elaborate upon, but I think you kind of already called out exactly where I was going with the Lemkin example and the kind of origin point with him. So you describe here within the early chapters, there's a kind of avoidance of crimes against peoples. It's this is a part of the kind of like I'd mentioned origin theoretically of what Lemkin is ultimately describing. And I'm wondering right there, because you say a little bit about this, but I'm curious when thinking about, again, crimes against humanity, against peoples, where this avoidance as it relates to, I think especially just the public understanding of it, but of course what we're really referring to is this is white Americans' reconciliation or lack thereof with crimes against Black Americans, particularly people of color broadly. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from is this a fear of kind of acknowledging this? Is it too inflammatory? What's it coming from?
So it's a great question. So not specifically about the US, I think the fear about crimes against people, most people are hesitant to really explore because it's really easy to do something horrific. It's one of those things where if you're a regular person and you make a bad decision one day to get in your car while you've had a couple more drinks, that decision at that moment could result in someone's life getting taken away. Right. And when people are made more aware of just the fragility of life, that's not something they want to confront. We like to imagine that we're strong and we could live forever, or da-da-da-da. And so thinking about how not only is it really easy for life to disappear, but it's easy for that to happen at an unimaginable scale, I think reminds people of the fragility of life. And a lot of people want to avoid that, just like people want to avoid thinking about death. These are just ideas that are integral to existence that people just don't want to think about at all. But in relation to America specifically, and why white Americans, those who really value their white essence, are reluctant to think about the situations that Black Americans face on a daily basis. I think they don't want to think about it because in many ways their existence for generations is dependent on Black people being in discomfort. And it's hard for them to imagine how they could be if the world was different, because there hasn't been a dynamic where Black people haven't been in discomfort in this society. So it's, and then another thing that I think is quite key is the identity that Europeans gave to themselves when they moved here was one of the one drop rule,
Right.
where if they get a drop of something that's not European, then they aren't themselves anymore. They're something completely different. They're erased.
Yes.
So there's no like middle ground. It's a zero sum identity. So any sort of like leeway and inclusion to any facet would be an erasure of the identity that's defined a lot of white people for generations. And there's a lot of fear about that, because they don't know how to live without this thing, but the thing is dependent on perpetuating bad things, and no one wants to believe, because, you know, at an individual level, people try to do good things for the most part, but, you know, seeing a futility in those endeavors because there's a at mass like dynamic perpetuating bad things is pretty debilitating. So
yeah,
I think it's something like that.
Absolutely. That's incredibly helpful. One of the other things that came to mind there is that with the acknowledgement of these bad things, these crimes, there's like within, we're going to get to this at a later point in terms of discussing more in a more robust way the master-slave dialectic and the way in which you describe it. But it also requires, it strikes me, as the acknowledgement of the humanity of those who are subjugated, which is something that's incredibly difficult, because ultimately what that's to say is we're on actually the same playing field, but I have more than you for reasons that are not attributable to like anything that I have done to kind of work to get there. It's ultimately just kind of been bestowed upon me. And you are also in like shit conditions, for lack of a better word, because of who you are. And there's nothing that either of us can do about this. Like I mentioned, we're going to get to this at a later point, because I think these are really, really important concepts to bring out. But that was something else that kind of jumped out to me within that section.
Yeah, I'd say like a key aspect of that is when you just look at colonization and the creation of, you know, westernized societies in the Americas, like the foundational idea of those societies was that the people that lived here weren't really people, and that the people that they forcefully brought over here, they also weren't people.
Right.
And so acknowledging the humanity of the people who, at a foundational level, the society was based on, independent on denying their humanity, that changes the entire social dynamic. And the thing that's, you know, troubling for a lot of people to acknowledge is that by acknowledging the humanity of the people who were supposed to be dehumanized in perpetuity, everything's different. And they have to confront that they don't know how to live in a world where someone else's humanity is viewed as equal to theirs, because the world in which they built is dependent on that lack of equality. And that's also something that's quite complicated and unpleasant for people to have to realize.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely an uncomfortable truth that is, well, I mean, given the discomfort that comes with it, it makes sense, at least in terms of how we have gotten to this point, that these sorts of truths are not acknowledged. And I want to kind of segue from this into like a particular passage, again, within the early point of the book, where you write, truth is irrelevant within ethnocide. America has countless examples of the meaningless truths that ethnocide creates, but race is the most obvious one. I'm really interested in what you're talking about with regard to meaningless truths. What do you mean by these under the kind of guise of ethnocide?
Yeah, so, you know, like a meaningless truth in ethnocide is essentially, that's a falsehood that we have just projected and have come to believe is true, while it's entirely false. You know, it's completely meaningless. And so, you know, a key truth that America tries to perpetuate is one of race.
Yeah.
And we all know that like ideas of race simply come from people in a particular part of the world living there for a long time, where they start forming unique characteristics that are different from people in other parts of the world. You know, like the African race is the African race because it's in Africa. The European race, it's in Europe. Same thing. And so the idea that if you leave Africa and leave Europe and go to someplace else and you eat the food over there and interact with all the different people that you're going to interact with, that your race would stay the same. That doesn't make any sense. You're in a different place.
Yes.
The place is what shapes the people. The people don't shape the place. Like the place shapes the people. And so America has this idea that these racial identities are going to stay static, that you're going to not be in Africa, you're not going to be in Europe, you're going to be in the Americas, and you're going to stay the race of the other continent, no matter what. There's no truth to that. It's just not going to happen. But America tries to say that it will happen, and it tries to do that by normalizing perpetual systemic oppression and division and all sorts of stuff like that. And so it's a fabrication. It's clearly an idea. It's not based on reality. And that's, like the amount of Black people in America that are considered Black, but if they go to Africa, they don't really look like that many African people, because there's been so many different types of mixing that they live here, which is perfectly natural to happen. If we're talking about race in a geographical location, the conversation would be about the process of creating a new race. But then if you do that, then like the legitimacy of the construct of race falls apart pretty quickly, because we're now just really talking about cultures and the impact of diet and weather and things like that.
Yeah, you're arbitrarily constructing sort of new categories in one way or the other. Yeah, and to this point, given like the expansive size of like just the continent of Africa and the various phenotypical characteristics of individuals that live there, different hair texture, different skin tone, a variety of these other things, to lump all of those into a single category that is Black in one capacity or another. I mean,
totally absurd.
It makes no sense. Absolutely no sense.
So no. it's an idea completely false, and this falsity is being projected as a truth and natural and inherent to American life, and you just couldn't create something more like counter to reality than that, than existence.
I think this really this reminds me of a sort of conversation that I have with some of my students some of the time when it comes to like thinking about like the social construction of race. I think the easiest way is like providing alternatives in terms of like other things that we could then project not race onto, but like another social category. So what I'm saying is we could basically classify people by like their eyebrows, like their eyebrow texture. Like we could just assign value to that thing, and that in and of itself would be another meaningless truth. But I mean, I think considering the alternatives of these sorts of things, like you're doing, is incredibly helpful in terms of just like putting on display the fact that these are meaningless truths. They exist out in the world, but they don't have weight. They're something that when we prod,
no meaning. They're hollow. They're completely empty.
Completely. Yep. Yeah. And I think so. I'm gonna move from this point to another that I think is just this was one of I thought one of your most fantastic points throughout the book. And it's so you say it's that America being perceived as post-racial. There is a kind of like discussion of America as post-racial, or the kind of like conceptualization. I don't think that this is really all that present within like conversation nowadays of like this post-racial America, but like striving for something along these lines. The striving and the attempt to reach it, you mentioned that it's really done without any kind of discussion of what this even looks like. And I think that's just such a good like straight point that I mean, again, we're kind of circling back to this original point of like meaningless truth, but it's like the question of it's something that we would otherwise want. Let's just say like within the public eye, not you and I, but just something that's discussed as the ideal, quote unquote. And there's no sense of what it even looks like. There's no sense of how things would be different.
Totally, like that's the thing.
Things would not be different. That's the thing. Anyway,
right? Like the narrative for post-racial is essentially that means they want to have the same racial divisions, but without the racial tension.
Yes,
that's what America is hoping for with that conversation. Now, if we just continued that as to like what post-racial would look like, that would clearly, if we're just logically thinking, talk about mixing of races. We're like, now we're post this racial construct of black and white. We're post that, we've made something new. And that construct will clearly result in there being fewer and fewer white people, not because looking like you're from Europe is bad or whatever, but we just know that if Europeans mix with people from other continents, they're not going to look European. Just like black people mixing with people from other continents aren't going to look just like how many different Africans look. Africa's a big continent, so there's a lot of diversity. But like, this is just what's going to happen. So the end result of post-racial, America steadfastly doesn't want to like think about having that. And I think another good way of thinking about it is that America describes itself as a melting pot, but we've never come up with the word of what the end result of the melting is. It's like the joke is that I give is it'd be like fondue, but you don't have the word fondue. It's just called, melting cheese. And that's the thing.
I said it's the process that people are like discussing and concerned with. It's not the outcome.
The outcome is this thing. And like, we don't ever want to define the outcome because we just really want the conversation to be a distraction from reality so that we can live with delusions in perpetuity. And it's like, well, that's tragic, but that's kind of what it is. And so, the book also, I put up this notion that, race is just an identity. It's an essence. It's not a culture. And so what you really need to do is not be post-racial. You need to be pre-racial, where you're talking about the cultural problem that preceded the racial construct. And, the book focuses on that because being post-it, it legitimizes race, which these constructs come from a bad source in the first place. So why would you legitimize a bad thing in the pursuit of making something good? That doesn't make sense. And so post-racial is just ridiculous. So I think pre-racial makes a bit more sense.
Well, say a bit more of what you mean by pre-racial in this sense, like in terms of how we might be able to conceptualize a U.S. and America like that.
Yeah, so like a good idea for pre-racial and like the Black community, we actually all Americans suffer from this linguistic absence, but like the Black community, we talk a lot about our culture. And that makes sense. And you can go to different parts of America and the South in particular, and you can see clear cultural things where like this is the food, these are the practices that Black people have created and cultivated in order to survive in this place. That is the culture. That's what sustains us. Now, the problem is that the name that we've been forced upon us, whether that was, words that are no longer socially acceptable or the progression we've made with Black, those are words that are based on our appearance. They're not based on our attachment to place. They're not based on like the work that we do to sustain ourselves. In most places, their cultural name is attached to a place and what they do. So like the cultural name of like a Scandinavian person, like if you're from Denmark, you're Danish. That's the cultural name. That's not your racial name. That's not an idea. Like this is the people at this place. This is their culture. And so what America has to do is have a conversation about the culture where we have an ethnocidal culture that is very destructive. And then there's the Black community who in this dynamic doesn't have the authority to destroy the environment and other people's culture. So they have to make culture. We have to make culture. We need to focus on naming that culture and not be so preoccupied with responding or reacting to these racial constructs that are meaningless. They're not significant at all. What's significant is the culture that we create, and culture precedes race. You have to create a culture to then start coming up with these ideas regarding, race or any kind of idea, religion or, something. And there's a whole part in the book about existentialism and existence preceding essence that speaks to this, but culture needs to be more important than racial constructs. And we need to focus on that language. And the book focuses on that language through naming ethnocide and all sorts of other aspects.
One thing on this creation, the idea of creating culture that comes to mind with examples that you provide, and I think some really pertinent ones, especially for the year 2021, like that have been discussed over the past year. So you say that Black institutions are attacked when they are perceived as posing a threat basically to their white neighbors. So when they basically acquire a certain level of authority, of like real competition, relative to those of their, in this case, like just their white counterparts. I'm wondering there, for one, is this, so this is sort of like a two-pronged question. These are, I mean, these questions function differently, so we can address either or both.
Cool.
But I'm wondering, are Black institutions sort of places where the manifestation of culture or culture born anew can happen? And well, I'll leave it there. I'll ask that and then leave it there, and then we can progress.
Yes, and by Black institutions, you just mean the places where Black people live, right?
Where Black people live, where they sort of congregate, where they come together,
Yeah.
where they mobilize in various ways, like yeah.
Those places are the, arguably the prime incubators for culture in America. So one key thing for the book is, when I first was working on it, people really wanted me to clarify what I meant by culture. Because in America, culture means you like the arts and entertainment and going to the theater and stuff, But what culture really means, it's a people in a particular place working together and creating and cultivating things so they could survive in perpetuity. That's why the culture in a warm place is different than the culture in a cold place. It's not because the people are better or worse. It's like they need to make different things to live in that place. So within American ethnocide, colonizers, people with a white essence, built a society where they lived off of extracting and exploiting the culture of other people. That's how it was. That's why if you look at the South, there'd be, adjacent to like the slave owner's home was where they kept, because he had to keep the people close by so that he could exploit them all the time. And the money that would come from that exploitation, that was his livelihood. And so this dynamic of perpetual inequality is part of the ethnocidal culture that America created. Black people within this dynamic don't have the social power to live off of exploiting other people. So they have to find a way to live by creating their own culture. Right. Regardless of the horrible situation, African Americans have always had to look at each other and say, what can we do together so that we can survive and create meaning in society? So, the food we're going to make, the music we're going to make, the clothes we're going to make, the traditions we're going to pass down. We have to make all of these things to survive. Yeah. The threat with an ethnocide is that if a Black person makes an incredible dish that has a lot of meaning in their community, and a white person tastes it, they're going to say, this is delicious. I can make a lot of money off of this dish. Yeah. Give me the recipe, Black person, and I'll make it. Or I'll pay you to make it, but I'll take most of the profits because I'm the businessman, And so now they're extracting Black culture for their financial gain. The same way, say this Black community builds something incredible. Yeah. And it becomes, despite all the hardships, on a scale that's equitable, right, or even close to equitable to the white communities.
The example you give with Black Wall Street. Yeah.
Black Wall Street, exactly.
Yes.
The impetus of that white community is we have to destroy that environment because Black people aren't supposed to be here in an equitable state. They're supposed to be here as subjugated people that they can financially profit off in perpetuity. That's the dynamic of an ethnocidal society. So Black culture communities have always been an incubator of arguably the most authentic American culture. Clearly, indigenous culture is the most authentic, but that's a culture that precedes America. The difficulty is, how do you keep that culture when you know that at some point your society is going to try to destroy it? Yeah. How do you prevent the destruction and transcend ethnocide? Because what's going to happen is like a perpetual cycle. You'll make something incredible, it'll get destroyed, and you have to start from scratch.
Yeah.
Start from scratch, make something incredible again, it gets destroyed. And this is a vicious cycle that no collection of people should ever want to sustain. So That's the thing. The culture is going to be there. Keeping it despite the inevitable attempt at destruction is the predicament.
The one thing I just want to focus in on with the Tulsa bombing, so in this case, the Tulsa Massacre, I'm wondering, because it strikes me that over really the past year, especially, there has been at least some more public attempt at like a historical reckoning with this event. And I'm wondering where you find that to come from, because I think I have like a few presumptions, but I think it's curious to me because it's just I've never seen it covered to the same extent that it was more recently.
Oh no, like I remember when I was a kid, my cousin told me about it, and I was like, what? I've never heard of this.
Yeah.
Really? But it's definitely gotten in the news more over the last like 6 years or so, I'd say. But I think to be honest, it's due to the fact that since the 1960s, America has allowed and encouraged to a certain extent people of different races seeing the humanity of each other. And when you say you're a white person and you learn about and you have black friends and you learn about the destruction of a black town by a white community, you're going to empathize with your black friend and say, this isn't something that we should continue doing. I'm going to encourage that this information gets out there. You know, that's you know, if you go back prior to 1960, that was just not a thought that was going to happen in America, period. It was, this information would make white people look bad. Therefore, the cultural incentive is to cover it up so that we can present, a genteel, civilized facade to the world. You know, it's literally just the fact that people of different races have been able to become friends now. And, I think we're talking about roughly a 60-year slow progression. And that's really what it is. There's more interracial couples now. That was actually illegal prior to, the Virginia decision, the Loving decision. And so it's just stuff like that. Like there's I think less of a desire within the non-Black community to conceal these horrors. And that's what I would say.
Got it. Yeah, that's an incredibly helpful explanation. I want to pivot here to discussing really whiteness and white Americans, because I think this is woven throughout the book, but I think there are like some really punctuated moments that are like enlightening and just deserve a lot more discussion and kind of theorizing about the future. So I'm going to read a little bit of a passage here. You write, white Americans have always engaged in a traditional dialectic with European immigrants. At first, new European immigrants, Irish, Italians, Poles, Catholics, etc., clash with white Americans as they confront bigotry and terror because their presence in America represents an antithesis to the thesis of white Americans. And so in this case, where you really lead to within this is this idea, especially within like the late 19th, early 20th century, with the arrival of these European immigrants, they're calling into question these ideas of whiteness in one way or another, and they're presenting, like you mentioned, an antithesis to the thesis of whiteness within the US. But then we come to a later point, again, kind of sticking to this Hegelian philosophy, like Hegelian sort of phenomenology that you're describing here of a synthesis, right? And the synthesis is ultimately the kind of inclusion of these otherwise previously excluded immigrants. And I'm wondering about this as it relates to the future. So we're at a moment, and this relates very closely to a lot of the work that I'm doing and thinking about right now in terms of the idea of a diversifying United States in this way that is potentially going to be entirely different from any previous era, in the sense of whites becoming numerically a minority relative to people of color, racial minorities in the US becoming a majority. And I'm wondering how you think of these coming changes potentially problematizing whiteness or not, given these ideas.
Yeah, I guess the key thing, like, and what a key component of the book is, like, whiteness in the book isn't just like a blanket term that gets applied to all people who look like they're from Europe, you know? So like clearly Europeans are different than Americans.
Right.
Like that's just a fact. You know, even if those Europeans look like other Americans, they're different.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about white, we're talking about white in a geographical American sense. And the question you just have to ask is, if these Europeans gave themselves an identity, and that identity has no attachment to place, it just has an attachment to a skin color, and that skin color, if it gets any aspect of another skin color in it, goes away. Think of the effort that's required to sustain that complexion when literally everything around you threatens to take it away. You know, like if white people mix with indigenous people, they're not going to look European anymore. They mix with black people or Asian people, they're not going to look European anymore. The identity they gave themselves kind of painted themselves in a corner. And so the problem isn't with someone who looks a particular way. You know, like people, we all are human beings. I think most of us are trying to, you know, do the best we can. It's just if you attach yourself to a problematic idea, and the idea is the sustainability of a European complexion while never being in Europe. Like that's just not sustainable. We have conversations about it as if it is, and that it's shocking that the numbers are going down. But like the numbers go down because white people will find someone who's not white that they said, I think that person's a great human being. I'd like to have a child with that person and live my life with that person. And then that kid that gets born cannot classify as white. At best, they could pass as white, but that's not being white. That just means that, you know, you get to fool people for an extended period of time. And so like, that's the problem. The problem isn't with people having a particular skin color. It's about pretending that something that is clearly unsustainable without, you know, it's only sustainable with violence and division. It's imagining that something that is unsustainable, objectively speaking, is sustainable and what's supposed to happen. That's a big problem. And that's kind of what we're confronting right now. And you know, that's the conversation that we're trying to have. You know, hypothetically, if you live in Europe and you know, there aren't that many people from other parts of the world that are immigrating to your country just for various reasons, and everyone there looks the same because they've all been there for a really long period of time, it's really easy to stay looking white. That's what logically would happen. That would make perfect sense, and that should happen for the most part. But in a place like America that has people coming in from all over the world and have people that were here for thousands of years who clearly weren't European, it's way harder to sustain that. And that's just a fact that we need to acknowledge, you know? And it's not a personal issue. It's just a fact.
Yeah, I mean, this connects. This is what you just articulated is exactly what you go over within the book with regard to the discussion of bad faith, like living in bad faith in one capacity or another. And so I think another great passage out of this, you say, within America, ethnocidal culture, within American ethnocidal culture, white Americans created our societal division in order to perpetually exploit black people. And if they were to cease exploitation and instead promote equality, this would result in race mixing and the extermination of their white essence, their identity. And I mean, ultimately what this is like this idea of creating a system that ultimately, like, it doesn't have sustainability, exactly in the point that you're saying, in terms of just like a staying power of maintaining white racial authority because of the purity that's assigned to it and the way in which it functions relative to, in this case, other, like, just race in general.
And to be honest, like this racial divisions that these colonizers created, it's not sustainable for anybody.
No,
you know, like my partner, she's Mexican. Like my partner is Mexican American. We just had a kid. That kid is lighter than me. Like in America, America's gonna say he's black because you have one drop of black, you're black. So he's gonna be black. But like racially, complexion wise, he's gonna look different. Clearly part of his facial, his features will look like me, but it's going to be a different person who, if he got on a plane and went to Africa, people might say, "Are you African?" And he's like, "I am. My dad's black. Here's a photo of my dad." And it's like, so it's not some unique dynamic that's exclusive to white people. It's just that there's more anxiety for white people regarding that dynamic because their culture isn't based on creating culture. It's based on sustaining their essence at the expense of the culture of other people. And so like there's not a cultural fallback on. There's not a template like this is how you live when you can't look a particular way. But for other people it's a bit easier.
And we talked about this this was our previous discussion sort of leading into this, where I mean that kind of existence is so alienating. Like that's something that is so the sort of absence. Like this is, you say this within the text, and I encourage like people within our audience, like for one, to pick up the book, like buy this book, but also like read this particular sort of passage where you say in a very, very brief statement, I believe this is like one of the last chapters, but that you wouldn't wish whiteness on your worst enemy. You're talking with an individual, and you go a bit more into depth about this. And I guess, say a bit more of what exactly you're referring to within that part.
Yeah. So that I remember that because I said that to a white friend of mine at a bar where we were chatting about race and stuff. And the dynamic in the book is my friend, I didn't know this at the time, but I kind of did. Her family were like, she's a descendant from slave owners in Charleston. Mm-hmm. And my family were free persons of color in Charleston. And when I was trying to figure out my place in the world, one thing I did is I looked back at my family history. I learned a lot about my ancestors in the 1800s. Yeah. And those people were oppressed. And I found inspiration from them. I found knowledge and wisdom and ways to live in the world. As a Black person, I can do that. It's really easy for me to look at the people who came before me and figure out ways to be a better person.
And you said also deal with obstacles, like deal with obstacles in the same way.
Yeah, be resilient, have a bigger picture, have the, just the idea that I would work during my life and the goal would be to provide something to my kids that I know I would never be able to obtain. Like that's an idea that people of color have all the time, which is very foreign to a lot of white people. Just that notion that you wouldn't be able to get it during your lifetime, not because you are bad, but because your society will actually prevent you from getting what you should get. And so my friend, when she would look at the past to see her ancestors, she wouldn't get wisdom. Yeah. She would find people who did horrible things and would justify doing these bad actions. And so when she's tasked with how to be a good person, how to live a good life, and she looks at where she's from, it's really easy for her to find nothing, almost nothing. And it's like, that's just so sad. Yeah. Clearly, as a Black person in America, these people who have, have a history that's not as pleasant that they want to conceal from themselves, they may decide to prematurely kill me because I look a particular way, and that's horrible. But that has nothing to do with me. Yeah. The shortened lifespan I may have will be filled with more of me doing good stuff and being a good person during that time than other people who have been instructed to do bad things and are trying to figure out a way to not act like their parents or their grandparents or their ancestors. Like that is just such a dilemma that I don't know how you would wish that on anybody. That seems horrible. Like one thing that I find shocking all the time is you turn on television and there's this narrative where like if a white person's parents or uncle or grandparents are coming to dinner, they're like groaning, like, oh, and they're bracing themselves for how horrible it's going to be around their own family. Like this is something that I just can't even comprehend. Like, of course, my parents or aunts, relatives, they might be annoying, but I'm not like bracing myself for how horrible it would be around the people who have tried to make me a good person because they're good people. Right. And like, that's just pretty simple to me. And so that's like one of the aspects of like, man, you might get a bunch of stuff as a white person. Like you might be able to buy things and have shiny things and live in an area that's apparently important. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to be worth it. It doesn't seem to be a good trade-off. You get materials, whatever, you know?
And I think that this is the point, the lead off point into the major kind of conclusion that you have, which is ultimately ways to combat ethnocide. Because so circling back to like the earlier theory that I had mentioned, like under what's described within the book, and for those of you that are familiar with Hegel, like described, I believe this is Phenomenology of Spirit. There's other texts, but the master-slave dialectic, in the way of there is a relationship between the master and the slave in this case, in terms of just the power positions of these two individuals, one that wields power over the other, where they're both unable to exercise freedom in important ways that tap into their own humanity. And so within this same sort of context, it's to say that neither person is going to be able to live a fulfilling life. And so, like, in this same sort of way, connecting to the example that you just gave with regard to whiteness, it's to say that, there may be some material gains of this, but ultimately, like, if you want to live a happier and, like I said, more fulfilled life, then combating ethnocide in terms of these major points that I'm about to get to, it would benefit everyone. That's the major. I mean, that's what I took to be the ultimate conclusion here.
100%. Like the master-slave dialectic, it's this concept by Hegel that really is quite important to wrap your brain around to understand America. The premise is this: there's a master and there's a slave or a serf, if you're applying it to Europe, and the master has all the power and none of the responsibility. And so if there's a great crop yield that year, he says, I did a great job. If there's a horrible crop yield, he says, that slave is lazy. It's his fault. If there's a great crop yield, the slave doesn't get any acclaim. But if there's a bad crop yield, he's lazy. Yeah. And so the slave has none of the power and all of the responsibility. And in this dynamic, neither person is free. Yeah. But since the oppressed person has to work, and even though he hates the work, doesn't want to do any of it, it forces him to become aware of himself, his faculties, his community, all this kind of stuff. This strengthens and enriches him, and eventually can provide the foundation for overthrowing the master and trying to create a better society. The master, on the other hand, they just get weaker and weaker because their life isn't dependent on them being good at things. It's dependent on oppressing the other people and ensuring that the other people do the work at a sufficient level. So they don't have strength. They just get weakness and growing dependence. And what this happens is America, the narrative of our society, comes from people who position themselves as the master. Thomas Jefferson, that guy owned hundreds of people. He clearly had this perspective. And so what happens is this notion of freedom is a freedom that's built on being irresponsible and powerful. And you can't have freedom if the goal is for everyone to be irresponsible and use their power in detrimental ways. That harms everybody. Yes. And in America, we far too often, you can see if someone gets into a position of power, what they try to do is use that power to isolate themselves. So if something bad happens, they can't be held responsible. Yeah. That's what America tries to do. And it's an extension of this dynamic, and it's detrimental for everybody.
And and to this original point of the master getting weaker, it's a constant effort to maintain your position of power. Like you're under the constant potential threat of an uprising in one way or another because you recognize the illegitimacy of your position. Like you recognize that it's not something that you've been that's been bestowed, that you've earned. That it's out of power. Yeah,
the structure doesn't encourage you to become a better person, to become self-aware. It encourages you to normalize and sustain perpetual oppression and come up with a narrative that allows you to remain weak and powerful in perpetuity. And I think it's pretty evident that we can see how this is the whole time. Like Donald Trump is probably one of the weakest, most powerful people in the US. Like the fragility of that man is outrageous. But the fact that he is weak and powerful resonates with a lot of white Americans who are accustomed to an ethnocidal way of life, and that is not surprising.
Yeah. Well, we only have a little bit of time left, and I really want to get to this because I think this is, like I said, you're building up to this particular point, but you're diagnosing the problem, but you're also providing a series of steps to move in the direction of combating ethnocide. And you give 3 steps, ultimately. You say, so I'm going to read the first step here. The first step, you say, is to recognize and raise awareness of ethnocide and create reactionary structures for combating it, such as laws and policies. Now there, I'm really curious well, for one, what these are, what you envision these to sort of be, if they're already kind of out there within the world, or if these are things that require, the work in terms of cultivating new culture, and then the sort of presentation of these new structures to combat.
Yeah. So there, the ideas are there, but people don't have the language. So like a good idea that lacks the language for this is housing. Yeah. We know that like America is a society that just has gentrification all the time. And we all know that like it's problematic, but we also believe that it's inevitable, that there's really nothing you can do. It's just the natural way that things are going to happen. Gentrification happens because we don't expect people to live in one place for a long time. And we expect people to view housing as a monetary investment and not as planting like roots in a community and creating culture. People of color, they view housing slightly not as much of an investment. Like it's like this is they're hoping that it's going to be like a multi-generational home. A lot of people. We don't have financial policies that encourage people to live in multi-generational homes. Like if that was a thing, that would be countering ethnocide, where you would just make it harder for people to do ethnocidal things because the housing wouldn't be available for potential gentrifiers because you're investing in a community over, 100-year window where you want people to be there for a very long time generationally. Like that's a simple policy that you could start formulating, but there's many of them. The key thing is if you have the language and the ideas, you can start formulating them rather quickly. Like it's recalibrating your mindset.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think also just as like a kind of two or like a small point to this, that it's very refreshing to hear you say all of this in terms of like diagnosing the problem and then like articulating, in this case, like what could be a plethora of solutions. Because I think you mentioned this throughout the book, but I also do feel as though at various points we get to a point within politics and discourse around topics, especially of race, where there's a lot of discussion of kind of like lip service to the issue in the way of like acknowledging the problem, but not a lot in the way of combating it, in terms of theorizing and really like working together in terms of thinking through solutions. It's really like getting to that initial spot.
Well, the key thing is that in America, for conversations to be deemed legitimate, there is an expectation that at a foundational level, everyone agrees that America's good, and that we're talking about are like deviations from the good, anomalies, and the goal isn't to create good things. It's to stop these bad things from happening. And if you stop the bad thing from happening, the inherent goodness of the society will fill the void. That doesn't work because ethnocide is foundationally bad. And so you can't just say, I'm going to stop this bad thing with the thesis that this bad thing is like a branch that's gone askew on a perfectly healthy tree. No, the roots of the tree are bad. And if you acknowledge that the roots are bad, then you start having ideas about how to like heal the roots and then grow new things. And so, you wouldn't have a conversation about stopping gentrification. You'd have a conversation about stopping the consumption of culture for monetary gain. So now we would create policies that are about cultivating and sustaining culture. And when it comes to housing, that would be encouraging people and families to be able to stay in a house or a series of houses in the same area for a very long period of time. That's like how the mindset starts shifting. And then also the key thing is once you start shifting like that, the next thing that you can then do is start thinking of things that you can do to invest and enrich that community that you're trying to make. And then now you just create sustainable practices from that, where you're not reacting, you're being proactive, and even your reactions are part of a proactive philosophy of making sustainable good things. And that's the key thing. We like a lie, or have a bad faith notion that America is inherently sustainable and good, and there's just really no track record for that idea. It's just delusions we like to believe.
For sure. I'm also moving through in terms of like the amount of time that we have. So you know what? I have an idea in terms of going over these 3 different points. I'm going to skip 2, and I'm going to basically say that for those of you that are listening, if you'd like to learn of point 2 of how to combat ethnocide, you should get the book. So we're going to get to, we'll move to point 3. And point 3, you say, is finally, we must cultivate a philosophy for focusing our thoughts toward creating good, not simply counteracting bad. And this is, I find this such an important point to emphasize, kind of harkening back to the other kind of like criticism that I've kind of leveled toward, at least, well, in this case, what have been kind of conversations that circle ethnocide in one way or another. But like I said, kind of pay lip service to the issue itself, but not really like understand in terms of criticizing and getting a lay of the land, but not really working toward creating good. And so I want to focus in on this point as a kind of a final note for our discussion. Is this, in terms of creating good, is this working together within community? Is this imagining a new world where in this case, like, ethnocide is not existent? Is it working to harken back to the pre-racial America that you described? What is it?
Well, it's a lot of things. Like the key thing is it's more than just imagining. It's literally articulating. So I have a whole chapter about the fallacy of the word utopia, where the word utopia doesn't mean good place like we think it does, or perfect place. It actually means non-existent good place. Like that's what the word literally means. Yeah. And so when you live in a society whose word that we believe means good place or perfect place actually means non-existent good place, then we're at a profound like dilemma, disadvantage, where like we don't even have the language to articulate living in a good place. Yes. So we then have to create a word. And so in the book, I created a word, and that word is evtopia. It's EU-topia, because EU in Greek is pronounced ev. And so what you have to be able to first do is articulate a good place. Yeah. This is good. Then the next question you have to have is, what does good mean? Yes. Because right now, what we think about good is very much in like a ecclesiastical, theological sense, where things are good because you'll get rewarded and you'll live in a good place when you're dead. Right. Or things are bad because you'll get punished and you'll live in a bad place when you're dead. But that actually creates a dynamic where you don't really have good or bad on earth, because we don't get confirmation for where people go when they're dead. Yeah. So there's no real proof that this action resulted in you going to a good place or this going to a bad place. Mm-hmm. So we have a world where we have the words good or bad, but we don't really know what they mean at all. Right. And if you don't know what good or bad mean, then you don't know how to make a good place or prevent yourself from making a bad place. And so what I do in the book is give the framework for like what good means in a real world sense, not in an ecclesiastical afterlife sense, but like in a practical living on the earth sense. What is good? What is bad? And the answer, or the analogy I use, is that of a good friend. Yeah. A good friend isn't good because they're good at a particular thing. Right. They're good because they help sustain you. You imagine that person will be around for a long time. And if you need them to do you a favor, they'll pick up the phone or they'll take it to the airport. They're a good friend. A bad friend is someone who you don't think will be there for you in a time of need. They're not that person. They might have a whole bunch of good things, like a bunch of money or a cool house or whatever, or be really pretty. but they won't be good because they don't help sustain you. And so good in a living on the planet Earth sense is sustainable. Good is something that nurtures you, that sustains you, that helps you live. Bad is something that doesn't sustain you, that doesn't nurture you. That's why, you know, smoking cigarettes are bad. It's not because when people do it, they don't feel good. It's because it'll give you cancer and it'll make you like live not as long. That's a bad thing. And so when you have a clarity about what is good and what is bad, then you can now start having the adequate discussions about how to make a good place at a micro level, like how to make your house a good place, and how to make the world a good place, how to have a good relationship, because you have a clarity on what good is. Right. That's the key thing. And so, you know, ethnocide is bad because it's unsustainable. You can't live and have a society based on the exploitation and destruction of the culture of anything and everything that's not European while you don't live in Europe. Like that's, you're going to consume the whole world around you and be left with nothing. That's not sustainable. You know, it's just, you know, that's why it's bad. We don't need to have a conversation about morality or ethics. It's bad because it's just not sustainable. That's bad, objectively bad. And so that's how you shift it. Once you have a clarity of what is good, you have a word that's called good place. Now you can have the conversation with yourself and the people around you. And like, I'll give a quick example. Like, you know, at one point I told my partner, I said, hey, like this word Eftopia is in my book. Like I have to do Eftopian things. Like this can't be lip service. So Eftopian stuff has to be how our house works. And she's like, so what's Eftopian? It's like, Eftopian are the things that we need to do to make sure that our house is something that we consider a good place, that we go back to every day. It's good. And so like, what is something that you think is necessary to make our house a good place? And she's like, we need to tidy up more. It's like, okay, that makes sense, because even if I don't like it, I'll know that by not doing it, I'm not making our society, our house a good place. I'm consciously deciding to like make it bad. That's a problem. And now you could have a conversation with me about like, why did you decide to let this be bad? Because you know that I think this is good and you agree that this is a doable good. Why did you do that? And I could say, I made a mistake. Okay, well, try not to make more mistakes. If you keep on making mistakes, now you just don't want it to be good. Right. And that's a very healthy conversation where it's not something personal. It's not because I'm a bad person. It could just be I was tired or it slipped my mind or something. This is how you make change, by having the adequate conversation and the language to do so. And that's what you do. And right now, the whole book is about that we're bereft of the language to even articulate the bad things that happen in our society. So we have to have the words to articulate the bad things in our society. And then we have to create a whole new batch of words to articulate what good means and how we make that. And I traverse that pretty expansive terrain in the book.
Yeah. And I feel, as someone who was not privy to this concept, at least in terms of the way in which you synthesize it in its relation to American history and the foundation of this country, and well, just your overall theorizing. I feel as though I've been provided by you with a better set of language and the ability, at least to start with like the kind of movement in the direction that you're suggesting. So for that, thank you. And I'll if you have a final note, then we can leave off on that. And if not, then we can call in ER here.
You know, I say the final note is that the goal of the book is to give people the language that they need and may not have known that they needed. And so now they have a better chance of articulating ways to make our society better. Yeah. And so I'm quite pleased that that's what you got from the book. And I hope everybody else that reads it gets that too, because then we can have the proper conversations and discussions to transcend the problematic place in which we currently live. And, you know, that's the goal.
Well, thank you. ER? Yeah, there he is.
Thank you both so much. That was so rich and dense, as you promised, in such a a lovely way. So I hope folks will click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide, and the Erasure of Culture in America directly from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. It also helps the world when you suggest that that local libraries carry this book, right? So we, are partnering with the Auburn Avenue Research Library, but if you buy this book and donate it to your local public library, to the library that that your kid goes to, whatever you have a connection to, it's always really important that we try to get these books that we are excited about reading out further into the world. Because if you are interested in these concepts and believe in these concepts, we want to be evangelists for these concepts. So try and do that to whatever degree you are able. And finally, I'll be adding captions to this and putting it up on our YouTube channel, so you can share that as well. It'll probably be a few days, but our YouTube channel is just /Charis Circle. So join us over there. There's also a long archive of events that have occurred during COVID. So go back through and check those out. It's a really wonderful. It's becoming a really wonderful archive, and we're really happy about it. So thank you both, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Pitner. We're very delighted to have you here. So I hope you both stay safe and well, and congratulations on your new baby.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So I hope that you continue to get to have fun in fatherhood. So I look forward to potentially hosting you in real time in the future, but glad to get to do this virtually.
My parents will love it. I'll be back home for a little while.
So. Exactly. Come to Atlanta. We'll luxuriate in all the space. It'll be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you both.
Take care. Good